You've been through a lot in writing this book, and it takes a lot to write a book, but especially a book that is so devastating in so many ways. And I know you had to write it. So no matter what else was happening in your life, no matter how it felt like you weren't making the progress that you wanted, or you couldn't find the time because he was also, had a full-time job on MSNBC, you were just determined to see it through. So how does it feel to finally be here and hold your book in your hand? And this is the first stop on your tour, so to see a room full of people to talk about this book.
One. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for that. The years, it sounds cliche to say they flew by, but they really did. I'm in such a spirit of gratefulness and thankfulness. And for the last couple of weeks, I've had like tears just sitting under my eyes. And even speaking now, I can kind of feel them there because I have so much gratitude for making it to this point, but also all the sacrifices, and not my sacrifices, the sacrifices of the people whose stories I've told, my own families, and all the wrestling over the years to make sure I'm putting respect on their names and doing it in a humane way, in a way that does everyone justice. It took a lot of work. But to be here today, like my story is now your story, my family's story is your story, but this was our story all along. Because as I'm telling my family's story, I'm telling the story of Black America right alongside it. And so it's just an honor and a privilege to be able to tell these stories. And be here now, like 10 years is crazy. 10 years, I had like one gray strip, like it just started to come. And now the whole thing is crazy.
That's true. Very gray now.
You haven't aged at all over the 10 years.
I mean, I got gray up here growing out of these braids myself. So, 10 years is a long time. And you're also, I bet you might actually shed a tear tonight because Trymaine is like a big old teddy bear. Like, he looks all gruff, but he actually is very sensitive. So let's just go to the beginning. Like, what inspired you to write this book? Why did you feel like you needed to write a book about gun violence in America and the particular toll that it has taken on Black people?
It's 10 years in the actual making, like the actual writing of the story and writing of the book. But the earliest seeds for 1,000 Ways to Die began back in 2003 when I was an intern in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia Daily News. And I worked the police beat. And when I started my internship, I really thought I was going to be like Richard Wright and writing features and through the lens of Blackness, but more feature-y. And I ended up on the police beat and crime beat. And so I'd end up at crime scenes and seeing people that looked just like me, literally my age, dead from gunshot wounds. And I was chasing all kind of calamity across the city. And there was this one story of a young man named Kevin Johnson. And he was shot in the back of the neck during a robbery for his Allen Iverson jersey in Southwest Philly. And I managed to get into his hospital room. And when I got there, I expected to find someone that was completely broken and devastated. He was a quadriplegic, but he was so buoyant and so full of life and smiling. And he told me about his dreams of walking one day and of playing basketball. And there was this moment when I looked across the bed and found his mother's eyes. And they were welling with tears because she knew and I knew the reality was he'd never walk again. He'd never realize those dreams. But it was the second part of that. There was so much loss in that moment. But when she started talking about the cost just to get him home, right? The new van, the special chair, the wheelchair ramp for their North Philly row home, the widening of the doors, the new outlet for his breathing machine, all that just to get him home. He'd already lost so much. They already paid so much of a hefty price, and there was a literal dollar amount that they would have to pay. And so I started to think, like, you know what? I don't think people really care about the Kevin Johnsons of the world. We do, but the world doesn't care about them. And so maybe if I talk about the cost that we're all paying, because they don't have private insurance, right? So every time a bullet shatters bone or splits flesh, we're all paying for that. And so that was the story I wanted to tell, and it was called $1 Million Bullets. That was the original concept. And then I would reel us in. It was kind of like a pill and applesauce to talk about the cost that families pay every single day. And then everything changed when I had a heart issue and I had a heart attack. And I had to really examine the expanse of violence and the ripples of violence and what it means to carry bits and pieces of that violence and how it manifests inside of us. And so the story I wanted to tell and the story that needed to be told were different things, and it became what it needed to be.
Okay, if you keep doing that, you're going to step on my questions.
Okay, I'm gonna stop doing that. I'm gonna stop doing that.
Keep it tight
Keep it
now.
tight. You're right. You're right. I'm talking to a real pro, a journalist here. You're
Right. So, so one, if you're not a journalist, then you may not know that a typical kind of cub beat when you're first starting out is they put you on the cop's beat. And so that's how you ended up on the cop's beat in your first jobs, which in some ways is, it's great because it just teaches you basic things like how to source, how to build go look at a police log. And news is always breaking, so you just have to learn, you just are forced to jump in. But it was also something where for me, I knew right away I couldn't do it. Like my very first couple of times being put on the police beat and having to go out where a black person had just been killed and try to talk to their family and watching the more grizzled reporters who didn't seem to really be moved by what happened. I knew I didn't have the heart to do that. But you talk about the toll that it also took on you to do that. We need people to do it. You need people who have empathy to do it, but you lose something as well.
I think it really is the best skill building practice, because back then, a lot of young folks won't know it now, but you had to get back to the newsroom and write it up before the press actually ran, because they needed to actually print the stories on paper. But you're forced under pressure to get the names correct and get the yearbook photos, and you're forced to do it forces you to get strong quickly. But it is a toll. And I remember having a police scanner over my shoulder and getting to crime scenes before the scene was even really set. And those moments of the great weight of the loss, because it's just tragic and it's violent, but then you would look across the street and see families broken. And so for me, even from my earliest days, I recognized that we weren't treated with a lot of respect in the way that the media and other reporters talked about the people who are dying in these places. Before we even know what the deal really is and how they arrive there, it's like garden variety. And so it was important for me to try to capture the last bits of their life in a way that gave respect, at least to the lives they lived, regardless of how they got there. But I remember one story of the many stories I still think about. It was a young kid who killed himself by accident. He was showing off a gun he found in his house with friends, and he killed himself. And that picture, I still have it, and I would come back to it time and again. A young, like 11, 12 years old. And those are the stories of these lives lost so soon. And there we are, mission-driven, to be the burden bearers, to tell these stories, but we also have to be cognizant. I think now we're just at a time to have conversations about what it means to protect your mental health, especially as a journalist. But no, it's never been easy. Yeah. Necessary, but not easy.
So sometimes, often over bourbon, we would bemoan how hard it is to complete a book.
Always over bourbon.
Yes. So Trymaine started his book, and then maybe a year later, I was on book leave. My book never came out, so you give me hope, because your book, I wrote a different book. But we would talk about our own personal stories in those moments, about how gun violence had stalked both of our families. But I didn't know so much of your own personal story was going to end up in this book. And it ended up being a much more personal book than when you first started talking to me about it. And it became so personal because you had your own brush with death. So can you talk about, and actually we were having lunch together the day that happened. Yeah, coffee. Talk about that, your brush with death, and how that made you start thinking differently about this book that you had already been writing, but were really struggling to figure out.
So 2 years after I started writing in earnest on the book, in 2015, in 2017 I had a heart attack. And that day, and as you mentioned, the New York Times had moved to like 30 Rock or across the street, so we were meeting to get coffee. And I remember going downstairs to meet you, and I said, I feel a little dizzy. Like, if I don't sit down now, I'm going to pass out. And so I said, I'm going to the health clinic at the job. So I went to the health clinic, and they hooked me up to like a little EKG, and she said, the left side of your heart is a little enlarged, but don't worry about it. It's not like you're going to drop dead tonight. It literally said that, and told me that it's probably some acid reflux. Literally gave me some like Zantac or something. And I said, I knew for a fact it wasn't acid reflux. But so I get home that night, and my wife was cleaning the bedroom, so I laid down, fell asleep. I get up, I go in there, and like 10 minutes later, I feel like this crushing pressure in my chest, and I'm sweating, and I'm nauseous, and the world is spinning. And it felt like my body was separating from itself, but I didn't think I'm dying or I'm having a heart attack. I just knew everything was caving in on me. And moments later, it kind of passed. And 10 minutes later, the emergency medical folks come, and they say, your vitals look pretty good. Do you want to go to the hospital? And I said, my daughter was a kid then. She had to go to camp. My wife had a work meeting. So I said, you know what? I'll wait until tomorrow, which is crazy. The vast majority of people die from a heart attack will die within that first hour. So long story short, I'm tossing and turning all night. I go to the emergency medical, like around the corner. And they're like, go to the hospital right now. Like, don't wait. We get there, hours and hours go by. And they finally did a blood test. And they found troponin, which is a protein that's released when you have heart damage, and said, we think you might have a heart attack. And still later, they were saying they'll get me in the cath lab the next day. But then my cardiologist, who was my cardiologist today, said, let's get you in there now. And so he's in there, and there's a big screen over my shoulder, and he's like, you can see my heart and all my arteries. And he's just talking to me, and he pulls it out. He's like, where's your wife? I was like, she's out there. He was like, you had a heart attack. I put 2 stents in there, and I had the biggest smile on my face because I was like, your boy made it. Woo. It was a close call. He said, if you didn't get here when you did, it might have been really bad. It wasn't until the next day, my entire family was in the room, my mother, my brother, my sister, and I made a joke about my wife. I said, yeah, you're about to be a thousandaire. And then I was like, you're about to get these few thousands. And then I was like, wait a second, she's about to have to collect death benefits on me. And I sobbed like a baby in my mother's arms. The only kind of hug like I cried. And I realized that moment just how fragile life was in that moment. And so returning to the book, which took some time, I put the book aside. I realized that the violence that we experience, again, isn't always against your own flesh. Sometimes it's silently within. And all those bits of ribbon that I collected over the years of all the kids who accidentally shot themselves, all the people shot by police, all the people shot by folks around the corner, I was carrying that and not fully processing it. And so when I had to fully consider the violence that we carry and the trauma that we inherit, and to answer my daughter's question, was 6 days saying, Daddy, how and why? And to speak on what was really bearing down on my heart, I had to be fully transparent and fully vulnerable and go to my own family and start asking the questions that I hadn't asked before about how we got here. And that story ended up being one that I think is reflective of what so many people in this country experience. And it had to be personal and it had to be vulnerable in a way that the previous iteration was more arm's length. I was going to talk about some of what we experienced, but never this personal. I never planned on doing this. And I pride myself on I'll be the people's voice, I'll amplify, but never my own voice. And so this was, and it wasn't easy, but again, it felt like I was compelled to.
Well, I think that wedding your personal journey, your family's journey, with the stories of the people that you are talking about is very powerful. And I think it gives you a credibility to tell the story. And you also just understand where that empathy comes from. I think a lot of times when we get into certain elite spaces and we're with our coworkers and they don't understand, we don't come from the same place. We might be in the same place, but we don't come from the same place. And one of the many conversations that we had through the years is it is a normal experience for Black people, no matter where they are in society, to have known gun violence somewhere, either in their families or amongst a friend, to have death, to know people who have been killed, to know multiple people who have been killed. Unfortunately, that's becoming a more universal experience in America just because of the number of mass shootings that we experience. But talk to me about, well, first let's go through a little bit of your family story, and then I want to talk about how that shaped how you were able to report in communities, because you have this own history. So you begin with a family story about your Uncle Cornelius. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your uncle and that story of violence?
So back in 1922, my great-grandparents, my maternal great-grandparents, were tenant farmers in rural Dodge County, Georgia. And in December, around settlement time, which is the time where the sharecroppers, the landowners basically rip you off for all your hard work. My great uncle Cornelius, who was 12 years old, was sent off to run errands, and he ended up being shot and killed in a neighboring sundown town. And we've never talked about this, I don't think, but like I always thought sundown towns, I thought it was colloquial. I thought that it was like just a bad place that you shouldn't go if you're black, like don't let the sun hit your ass, like that kind of thing. But in my research, finding that what was interesting about this community called Fitzgerald was that it was one of the few places in this country founded by former Confederate soldiers and former Union soldiers. And they were so proud of the fact that they would name the roads after Confederate veterans and Union veterans as this show of like coming together. But these white men came together and also voted to make sure that black folks didn't have a place in the town to work or vote or anything. And it was covered by a bunch of major newspapers at the time who said that Fitzgerald handled the Negro problem the way no other place could. And this is where Cornelius, 12 years old, was shot and killed. And when I came across the death certificate that said age 12, cause of death, gunshot wounds, it's so striking in how simple and straightforward it is. And you can't help but think about Tamir Rice, that little chubby face, and the thing about Cornelius, who I've never seen but can imagine. That killing sent my family into the waves of the Great Migration. And my grandmother, who was only a year and a half old at that time, joined my great-grandparents to Philadelphia first and then South Jersey. And then much later, the specter of violence strikes again in a place that's supposed to be the promised land, where so many people were fleeing the violence of the Jim Crow South for more opportunities and some solace. And what they found often is more of the same, where in 1951, her 17-year-old brother was shot and killed by a state trooper under mysterious circumstances that sound just like Ferguson and Mike Brown. And the headline that I found says, "Trooper's gun kills youth." And it strikes me that the gun just popped up and shot this youth in a place that he worked. Exactly. A ridiculous story, which I go into more detail in the piece. And to think then that my great-grandparents, who fled the Jim Crow South on the heels of the murder of their 12-year-old, I have a daughter that's 13, your daughter's a teenager, a 12-year-old, and then to lose another teenage son in the matter of decades. And talking to my aunts and uncles who were 6 and 7 years old at the time, they say he was such a stoic man, but he was crying in that church in East Berlin, New Jersey, crying out for justice. Weeks later, that officer was killed in a motorcycle accident. And they said, Jesus works. Jesus works in strange and mysterious ways. But still, years later, my grandfather was killed in 1976. My grandparents owned an apartment in Camden, New Jersey, and a guy came to rent it and left a deposit for $160 and left for many weeks. When he came back, wanted his money back, my grandfather told him that was non-refundable. I'll see you in court. He came back and murdered my grandfather. So now my grandmother has had to bury two brothers, and a husband who was a patriarch who everybody loved. There's a picture in the book that I just love. And you see how my family is handsome and my uncles and this whole family shattered. And by the time I meet my grandmother, obviously years later, the sweetest, most Jesus-loving woman you could ever meet. But that she was bearing that kind of burden, I would have never known. But my family has carried the absence, right? My mother describes it as having like a phantom limb. You learn to move forward, but you're hobbled by it. Like you know it's there. And then years later, in 1996, my stepbrother was murdered in Camden. A girl shot him in the back of the head. And in the early 2000s, I had a cousin murdered in Atlantic City, and his brother was involved in a botched robbery turned murder, so now he's in prison. So the idea that I've been spending my entire career telling the stories of Black death and people trapped on the wrong side of bullets, and my own family had experienced that. I always knew about my grandfather. I knew very little about what came before. And so then it starts to make sense of how people are hyper-vigilant and how people are in this continued state of grief and mourning, and how it shapes the way we raise our children. We could never have toy guns when I was a kid. My mother didn't even like the sound of balloons popping, like that kind of thing. And then to go back all these years later as a reporter and read the newspaper accounts, because so much of this book is based on that contemporary account of stories I've written 1,000 times, right? And matter-of-factly, when my mother talks about going to the court, the trial for the man who killed him, and having to sit there and watch pictures of her father's dead body, what that does to you, but you carry it quietly so you can have the strength to move forward. And it's shameful, that weight.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I just think, because it was Philadelphia, then you went to Trenton.
In terms of my
Your
so I
journalism
started
career.
I started in Philly in the Black Press, then went to Trenton, New Jersey. Yeah.
And then you went to New Orleans. So cities where the cop beat is no joke, any of those cities. And so you write about those experiences. And as I was reading it and also just thinking about your story and thinking about, my early days as doing cops reporting, luckily I only had to do it on my weekend shift. But just remembering how callously so many of the journalists seem to treat the families. This expectation. You all have seen the stories. No one expects this to happen here. Well, nobody expects their child to get shot. I don't care what neighborhood they live in. No community is accepting of death, but that constant way of like disrespecting our mourning and our grief. And so I imagine you having that experience with your own family and experiencing that loss and understanding, even if someone had been involved in some criminal activity, didn't mean that they didn't have dimensions, that they didn't have love, that they didn't have families who loved them. Talk about, so you have this line where you say, each time I wrote of these last breaths, it was as if a piece of me was breaking too. Talk about that experience that, of course, you're also internalizing. One, you're a Black man. Two, you've experienced this loss in your life. It is hard sometimes not to feel predatory when you're asking people in their darkest moment to talk to you. And you talk about this guilt that you carry with you. Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, I mean, you described it perfectly. Like, there's this expectation, like, people owe us anything for our jobs. And I never felt comfortable moving like that. Even when you're being your most humane and accessible, there's still something exploitive about the dynamic here. I'm getting so much more out of it than you ever will. And so knowing that I always tried to move with great respect and great care. And if I had to go back to the newsroom and I didn't get the picture, I didn't get the quote, then that's what it is. I usually did get it, and I got it over other people because I moved like that. I'm not making anybody do anything. And I always understood that when we leave and the cameras are gone, the family they have to sit with that. Yet and still, I always did feel like, especially where some of these organizations have a long history of mistreating Black communities and poor communities and marginalized communities. And every day the headlines will scream that disrespect. And I'm part of it. I got the badge around my neck. So it was always that dance, but I always did believe that the mission required, to go in those uncomfortable situations and paint the reality of it. And that doesn't mean the reality is always pretty, because it's not always pretty, but it's true, and it's honest, and it's humane. I try to do that, but it wasn't, feels wild. Like, man, I'm with the XYZ publication, and then the next week there's gonna be a wild op-ed or something, or a wild column, or some sort of racist mistake, something left in the headline that portrays some kid some way. Not easy.
Yeah. The thing is, though, a lot of times people, they want to talk to you because they want their loved ones' lives to have been acknowledged. And just think about the murders in this city. Half the time, they'll say a 17-year-old was shot and killed, and you never even learn that child's name. You never get a follow-up. It's nothing. So I've always thought about, whose names do we learn? Whose lives, when they're murdered, is it shocking? We think we should pay attention to, and whose do we not?
And they don't even deserve any context.
Yes.
Telling me that somebody got shot on 158th Street doesn't do much, unless you say it's in the third one as many weeks, and this happens and this happens and that happens. So now I can understand what's actually unfolding. Just giving me a kid with no name that's shot, it only feeds some of the negative stereotypes.
That's right. We fill in the blanks. When we don't have information, we fill in the blanks with our own stereotypes. So this book has so many angles that you're telling the story of gun violence. You have your personal story. You have stories from people you've met along your reporting journey, living victims of gun violence, family members of people who died from gun violence. You trace gun through the courts. You talk to funeral directors. You talk to a guy who worked in a gun shop, or not a gun shop, but a gun factory. So tell me just about how you were thinking about trying to show how? Because originally, I know you wanted to trace one gun. We won't talk about that though. Okay, but just like
I kind of was
you,
able to.
you did though, right?
Yeah.
So why did you decide you needed to tell this story from all of these different angles, and all of these different ways that gun violence, it creates industry, the legal ramifications, the personal ramifications. Talk about that.
So one device that I use often in storytelling is I like to literally move through geography, and I like to give myself some boundaries to move within. And I always imagined, even in the earliest concept of this book, is like I want to hold your hand and literally walk the reader through from this point to that point, and every step along the way, understand the impact of this thing. And the original idea, which I stole from a movie called The Red Violin, where they trace this violin back through time. And every life it touches, it changes everyone dramatically. And so I was like, what if you had a gun just to show from the time it's forged out of steel, wherever it is, to the time it ends up over here using a crime. Every single life it touches, all the riches generated from it, the spoils of it, I want to do all that. That was the toughest part about the book, because it was access, and it was just very hard. But even from, I start with the guns for slave cycle. And so I wanted to move us for how the gun played such a central role into our getting to America. And then once we get there, now we're through enslavement and freedom and Reconstruction, and then Jim Crow with my family, and then the redemption period where they try to push us back as far back into slavery violently as they could, up through the migration, landing in these places. And then to get in to Chicago and be able to do some backtracking to finding a weapon. I wanted to be able to make the storyline, like there has been no step that our lives haven't been touched by this. And it was tricky, but I think being able to connect my own story to it made it a lot easier, because we can still travel through geography and time. And it was tricky, but I think I finally, it took 10 years, but I finally got it in a way that it's smooth and it makes sense. But it was always intentional from the beginning to do that.
Yeah. I mean, one of the greatest geographic areas that you spend a lot of time in the book is Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And you tell the story of Thomas Wortham.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember how hard you were trying to get that family to talk to you.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just can't. And you really struggled with whether you could tell that story or not.
It was hard.
Without the family's cooperation. So talk to us about why Chicago, and then what it was about this story of Thomas Wortham that you just felt no matter what you had to tell it.
Yeah, that was the biggest sticking point in the whole book. Chicago has such a specific kind of blackness, and if you ever spend any time in Chicago, everybody still sounds like they're from Mississippi, because during the migration, folks would follow the railroads and the straightest geographic line. So a lot of folks in Mississippi are going straight north. If you're from Louisiana, you're going to Texas to California. If you're from Georgia and the Carolinas and Virginia, you end up in Baltimore and New York. And so the kind of bold blackness, the kind of specific migration kind of blackness, it's just a special place. The jazz, the food, it's just perfect example of what it means to be black in this country in this very specific kind of way, singular kind of way. But then also, they've been so weathered by gun violence for so long. Because of that migration, folks getting there, being cloistered into slums, right? Red lines drawn around their communities. As Dr. King found, a violent kind of racism that he didn't even find in the Deep South, keeping those barriers erected between opportunity and white folks and black folks. And so it's the perfect storm. And also you have guns seeping in from neighboring communities and far away. It was the perfect storm to tell this story, but also, again, putting some respect on the black people of Chicago who have helped shape what it means to be a black politician in this country or a black musician in this country. They're special, unique people that I wanted to show some respect to, given what they have to deal with in proximity to the violence and all the systemic violence. And so then I come across the name Tommy Wortham, who was a young police officer who had served multiple tours in Iraq in the war. A young man who was beloved in his community, the kind of young man, regardless how you feel about police officers, the kind of young man that you'd be proud to call your son or your brother. When he came back from the war, his community, Chatham, which had been a bastion of black middle classdom, started becoming a little under siege from more poorly violent communities on the outskirts started kind of dripping in. And so I came across this article where he was at the basketball courts and he talked about taking back and cleaning up the park across the street from where he grew up, where his grandfather built that home brick by brick with his own hands. And he ended up getting shot and killed while a group of young men were trying to rob him for his motorcycle. He had just gotten back. He was committed to the community. He was this beautiful young black man with all the promise, right? Shot and killed by some gang members. And the gun used was trafficked from Mississippi, from a young man from Chicago who went down to Holly Springs, home of Ida B. Wells, the proud history of Russ College, an HBCU down there. And then I was able to track the gun back to Massachusetts when it first came off the line. But when I first reached out to his mother first, she was open to talk. And it was just a few years after he was killed, open to talk. His father was open. His younger sister, an attorney, was angry from the start, rightly so, carrying the grief of it all. And here I am. I'm not even from Chicago. I'm not even a Chicago journalist because they talked to press in the past. That's part of how I was able to find them, through all these press reports. And I did all my FOIA, which is a request for all the documents. So I was doing this for all the cases. I just need to understand as much as I possibly can about this case. And so she found that I FOIA'd it. She was pissed off that I FOIA'd the family. Again, I understood it. And so I backed off and I said, I can't tell this story because I've never written a story without someone saying, like, you know what, I'll talk to you. But in telling this story, it was so important. And Tommy Wortham's legacy and memory and what he stood for was so important that I did it without their cooperation. It was such an important cog in connecting the dots between the gun rolling off the factory floor and being trafficked. And I hope when they see this, that they see that I'm honoring what was lost and why it was lost. Because it's not just gang members are wild in Chicago. There is an entire ecosystem and an industry that feeds off of the death and the fear, right? So that was tough, and I hope I did it. I hope I did it the right way, because I'm going to Chicago, and I'm gonna let her know, just out of respect, because don't be showing up at the right, So I'm gonna let them know, and
So I'm just looking at the time. I think I have time for a couple of more questions. One of the final stories that you tell in the book is in the chapter called Giggle Box, and have not been able to get that story out of my mind since I read it. So why don't you talk to us about that story?
This is the New Orleans chapter. Just weeks before Katrina, a little girl was shot and killed with her mother in their shotgun-style home in a traditional New Orleans neighborhood. And one of my police sources said that the little girl must have been looking up at her killer because of where the gunshot was. It was a terrible story. She was like 7 years old, a little girl, beautiful little girl. And so when I went to her neighbors and I went to her school and I talked to all her teachers, they said she was the most smiley, giggly little girl that you've ever met. And they called her Giggle Box because she was such this just adorable little ball of energy and just always smiling. And one of her neighbors, who was standing outside behind a wrought iron fence, said that a great flood needs to come and clean up this mess we're in. And that little girl's death. And I wrote this in the newspaper then. So I wrote a story about this killing. And I wrote that quote in there then, weeks before Katrina. Weeks. Weeks later, indeed, a flood comes and changes everything. Another kind of violence. But long before that flood, there was a different kind of flood where people in New Orleans had weathered so much pain and so much trauma, despite them being known for letting the good times roll. And they will let good times roll because they understand the precarity and the preciousness of life. But a friend of mine named Deborah, who I just met like days after I got to New Orleans, I met her and she came from California. That story stuck with her in a way. So even after I moved away, she would email me every other year. So we lost touch. We didn't communicate much. But she would check in about Giggle Box. Did I hear anything? And then she finally got word that the suspect in that case was shot and killed across town. And so Deborah went on. I went to New York Times. I bounced around MSNBC. And she became a journalist herself, covering the second line culture and brass bands and culture and society. and she was covering the second line on Mother's Day in 2017, and a shooting broke out at the second line. It was one of the biggest mass shootings the city had ever seen. 20 people shot. Deborah was the most gravely wounded of all of them. Two brothers saw some of their rivals and just lit up the whole parade. Her insides were torn up. And when I met her, she was a heavier, thicker girl. She had lost like 100 and some pounds. She was skinny. She barely survived. But she managed to survive slowly and put her life back together, physically put her life back together. And so as I was writing my book, and after I had my heart attack, I went down to see her, to reconnect with her, to talk about the toll that those bullets had on her, what she had gone through, and that she had recovered, she had survived, and she forgave the young shooter. She was adamant about that in newspapers, in op-eds. She said the system is the violent part that created these young men. Their story ended up being that their older brother beat their stepfather to death in front of them because he was abusing some of the boys. So they watched their older brother murder their stepfather. The kind of violence that these young people have experienced. But she was adamant about that. And so we have this amazing time talking, reconnecting, and she's pouring her heart out and telling me the story of how she survived and what it meant to her to live and to fight on. Months later, she died. Months later. Months after I talked to her, and like 4 months later, she died. And it was just like, what the ripple of violence. And as we know as journalists, when people survive, do you know what survival often means? Right? Like what living sometimes means, without a limb, right? Without control of your insides. And all that entire chapter was a lot, because you have Gigglebox and the flood and Deborah, and what does it mean to believe in someone who tried to kill you and believe in redemption and reclamation. What does it mean to forgive? What does it mean to really understand the true violence in this country, right? In the systems. What does it mean to hold all that and still be trying to survive and live? And she did for so long, for years. And then for her death, that's the problem, right? It hurts so bad because of what we're losing. And that's the part about the book. Certainly it's heavy. Certainly there's a lot of death in it. But it's about love and life and our people, right? And there ain't nothing wrong with us. I know you love that one too. Ain't nothing wrong with us. For us to understand what's wrong with us, let's engage with all the machinery around us and the violence baked into every fabric of this place and how we've survived it, right? How we've survived it despite it all. Thank you. But thank you. And to see her again that last time was just because she was herself. She was like gregarious, and she was like, so I'm glad the last time I saw her was she was beautiful.
Yeah, that chapter was hard. Most of the chapters in the book are very hard.
It's not easy. It's important, but it's not easy.
But we have to confront the realities. Because this is a society that has been created, and I think you just do by tracing the history, like you said, going all the way back to the continent, up to the modern day. You show how this has been created, and how we are all mutually trapped in this cycle of violence and killing, whether we think we are or not. And often we don't think we are, because we think segregation contains the violence to just certain communities who are somehow deserving of that violence. But clearly that's been shown not to be true.
And at the same time, some people are getting rich.
Yes.
There's a whole industry, billions of dollars in revenue every single year. And part of it is they're stoking the fear of, who they're afraid of, who they're stoking fear of. It's us. Right? So they love this point to Chicago and say, look at them. And so they can get rich off our pain and bloodshed.
That's right. So, okay. I'm going to ask one last question, then I'm going to open it up to Q&A. And I guess it's just, we both write about the most intractable social issues. I imagine you, like me, write about things that you fully expect will not change. So what do we take from that? What do we take from this book, 1,000 Ways to Die? You end it talking about your daughter. And I know that that is intentional, that through all of this pain and horror, um, we still love, we still make love, we still have children, we still find ways to survive. So what do we take from this book? What do you want us to walk away having read this book with?
I think to start with that point you mentioned there about my daughter and going from that curious question she asked when she was 6 years old to now she's a teenager, which is, I can't, teenager. I was choked when I said teenager. That our stories are ours to write, right? And even when they're hard, we have to be honest so we can move forward, but also see who we are in the context of this. But I think for so many of us, we wonder how we got here. And for many of us, we see the violence on the news, and we see the violence in our communities, and we see young men mostly who we love, and we know there's so much potential there. And some of them have taken it for granted, and some of them don't believe that society loves them because society doesn't love them. It does not. And they're looking around and they're looking for some warmth, for someone to say it's different, that they do love them. I want them, those young men, as I did reading the autobiography of Malcolm X and all those books, say, wait, this is a setup. All that they want us to fail. I want them to understand the cogs of the bigger machine and the industry and all these other forces chipping around every corner so that we can maybe make our spirits bulletproof, but also in doing so, their worth and value, right? Because there is an issue about conflict resolution. A lot of these young people don't know how to resolve conflict because everything is life or death. And it's about respect and power and hunger, right? And so I want people just to understand, when you see that young man dead on the front page and we want to automatically assign blame, there's a blame to go around. But there's also great love, and we've pushed through before. And we've gone through the darkest of times, right? So it's the violence from within, but also, as we see from this administration, a continuum of violence, political violence, the erasure of our stories, that we have to keep pushing and we have to move forward. And we have. And that our children need to carry this burden too of telling the truth. And my child, Nola, I can't see her right now, wants to be a journalist. So it is on her. It's incumbent upon her and the next generation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You know, it's crazy. This is the first stop. I'm like, I'm going to have to do this 7-8 more times. Whew, I just gave it all myself.
It's a beautiful thing, though, to see people gathered in a space because you wrote words, right? Not for no silliness, but for something very serious. A whole bunch of nerdy-ass people. I love it.
Thank y'all.
I love it. Like I say all the time, now is the time for reading. What you need to know, you can't get off social media. You better read some books, y'all, especially now. Okay, so we're going to open it up to questions. Now, I know I'm supposed to say, like, ask a question, don't make a comment, but I also feel like when you have a conversation like this, there has to be a bit of an exchange. I know you all are bringing your own experiences into the room as well. So what I will say is just, you can share a little bit, but please just make it brief so we can try to get as many questions as possible. I'm going to go with, am I calling? All right, this is right here. And I guess we're not passing the mic, so just speak loudly, and then I'm going to repeat the question for the recording. The question is how, in these dark, dark times, how do we protect our mental health and our children's mental health?
The one thing I would say, and I think in a very practical way, and I had to learn this myself because I wasn't, employing great coping methods when I was a young journalist. We were just hanging out more and, working harder. I think we all, young people, but also almost old people, because I ain't old yet, almost. I'm getting there, but God willing, seasoned. Is to find healthy ways to process all of the tough stuff as it comes in and not let it build. And so for me, the heart attack forced me to engage in healthy ways of coping. And it's like meditation and breathing and mindfulness and outdoors time. I became a fishing fanatic. No, for real. I'm trying to like do all this so I can go fish one day and I see y'all twice a year. I'm only half joking. I'm only half joking. But to be able to be with myself and outside of the noise, and find something that brings me joy and happiness, and also realizing that nothing matters more than my health. Nothing. Can't no company, can't nobody tell me that I can't go work out or I can't do something that protects me. And I think that's where we have to be situated. But also, I stopped sharing on social media every time somebody gets shot and killed or a video, right? We have to be careful of what we're consuming. You have to take it, you have to take it as it comes, but being very intentional about that. Thank you. This is what you call a don't get fired moment. I'm actually joking. I'm joking. I ain't worried about these folks. Yeah, exactly. So I think first and foremost, and I appreciate your question, and a lot of us deal with this in various industries, right? Doesn't matter what it is. I think what's important to understand is that it's still the plantation, right, and the plantation system, right? And so every day I know full well I'm going into the plantation house, the big house, and I'm asking for them to fund the coverage of the back corner of the plantation where everybody's getting sick because when it rains, the roof is leaky and it's muddy back there. I know that. And so I know the dance we have to do. But it's my job to still go in there and get the resources I need to tell the stories. And so the only way that any of it makes sense, because again, I've known this from the very beginning, I know where we are. And I know there are different forces inside the newsroom, but I'm not here for that. I'm here to make sure that my stories are told in as many places, in as many ways as possible. So I'm not worried about, the plantation, the big house is the big house. And this is where we are. But I think it's always been incumbent upon those of us with the microphones and cameras to make sure we're just telling those stories. And it's not easy. There's a young man named Jason Blair years ago who got caught up in the New York Times for plagiarizing. And around that time when I was coming into the industry, the big conversation around journalists was like, man, they ain't gonna hire nobody. And then they didn't want the ghetto beat. You know what, the police stuff was always called the ghetto beat. Black journalists didn't want the ghetto beats because they didn't want to be viewed a certain way, right? I took umbrage with that. I wanted to tell our story because you can't trust it. Who are you going to trust to tell our stories? Even those stories, right? I think it's the awareness. We can't ever be fooled that it's something other than what it actually is. And it's the plantation, and that's the baseline. That's the default for all of this, right? So I think that helps. You can't go in there and be blindsided. I've never moved like that. It's like some people, I got no haters. I got no haters. I don't know. I don't engage with people like that. That's never been my job. I don't have the temperament for that kind of thing. I'm not necessarily worried about what anyone else is doing. I'm there to tell my stories. And so honestly, I've never been in that situation because I'm not worried about them.
He really means that too. Uh, he does. That's what I respect. Go ahead.
I'm no expert in that at all, but I've had a lot of conversations and done a lot of reading about these so-called diaspora wars. So we think about Africa and the Caribbean, and sometimes like the Caribbean is America, right? Like Dominican Republic might as well be New York, right? Or Haiti might as well be because of the nature of the colony, right? And the nature of the exploitation of the land and the nature of all that. But I'm no expert, so I don't know.
The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Black Brazilians face some of the highest rates of police and other violence of anybody in the diaspora. And just quickly, you can go. So the UN has a whole division that looks at, and they put out reports on the experience of Black people in diaspora. And every single thing you can measure, Black people who are descendants of slavery across the Americas experience the same thing that we do here.
Thank you for that question. I don't have any expectation one way or the other, but I think what's important is that lawmakers walk away hopefully seeing us as more whole and more human. The president in recent days talking about his occupation or the threat of occupation of some cities essentially said that the people in these communities are subhuman. They're born to be a certain way. There is some innate criminality or violence within us. And there was no backlash to that. Because guess what? Most of them agree. When you think about the 94 crime bill, there were a lot of Democrats who sided with it, certainly because communities felt like they were under siege, so something had to be done. But the answer isn't, as some said, bringing people to heal, right? And that kind of energy permeates, right, all their policy. And so hopefully they see us as more humane, because right now I don't think they truly do. And it sounds hyperbolic to say they don't see us as full humans. I don't believe they see poor black people, especially, as fully worthy of human dignity, right? Because then you could send troops in. Look how police treat black women. But short of the gunshots, the dog bites, there are reports. The DOJ did a report after Ferguson looking at dog bites. The amount of dogs that are sicked on people, shredding their flesh every single day in this country, or getting beaten with batons, or getting punched in the mouth, handcuffed, that's bad enough, right? And so it's clear to me. Hopefully they walk away understanding a little more like, there's a history here. Okay, understanding the system, the system they should understand better anyway. So thank you for that question.
Okay, let's take one more question.
Yeah. So of all the chapters, New Orleans stuck out, and it wasn't for the obvious reasons. It was the police, the systemic violence within the police, and the actual violence that they heaped on black people during the flood. New Orleans has long had one of the most corrupt police departments in the country for decades. They were running drug rings, a couple cases where they murdered their partners, they killed other cops. The embezzlement, the corruption is wrought within the NOPD. But what I found in those early days, like the first week, people were coming to me, because I was one of just a handful of journalists who were stuck in the city. They were saying that the police were killing people and dumping their bodies in the river, right? They were saying this. Zero way to confirm that. So a lot of that didn't go reported early on because it was just 80% of the police departments were underwater. But what we would find out in the years to come is that police were indeed killing people. In one case, a gentleman was shot by a cop, a sniper essentially, because they had the green light to shoot so-called looters, right? It wasn't clear that he was a looter or not. He got shot. A Good Samaritan picked him up and took him to a nearby school to get some aid where he knew that a SWAT team was. They end up beating both gentlemen up, putting a bullet in the guy's head, putting his body in a trunk and setting it on fire, right? This is what was happening in the aftermath of Katrina. As people were trying to escape the city on a bridge called the Crescent City Connection, the parish police officers across the other side of the bridge were firing over the heads of folks. Then you had vigilante groups, white vigilante groups, right? Essentially deputized by police and police authorities to shoot and kill black people. And they did, right? And so if we thought it was bad before Katrina, it's like 20 times worse during. And some things we'll never know, right? We'll never know. And this is in a city already known for all kinds of political corruption, right? But no, I appreciate that, man. It was worse than I could have imagined. But then being there, it wasn't a leap because I saw some of it. They were looting. The police officers were looting Walmart. No, seriously, they were walking out with stacks of DVDs with uniforms on, let alone the violence.
Okay.
Okay, on that.
I know. It wasn't exactly the note I thought we would end on, but
Is there one more? Do we have time for one more question?
yeah. Oh, will the recording of this be available? People who would know that? Yes?
The recording will be behind our paywall for the next 2 weeks, and then we'll upload it online to YouTube.
Okay. Did you want to take one more question? Hold on, sis.
Let's take one last one.
Let's take
in the back.
somebody who hasn't. Is it just okay? Right here. Wait, was there one in the back? Okay. Okay. Look, we're gonna take these last two, but just please try to make the questions,
We'll go ladies first.
brief.
We'll go ladies first.
Oh,
Or not. Ladies first.
all right.
Good evening. I'm so happy to see you two together. Situations like that.
I would say Nikole has found herself in this situation more than I have. I've tried to avoid those situations. I don't have the temperament for it. It's not my job to wrestle and argue people down about our humanity. That's just not what I'm positioned to do. But I think we have to be careful in having those arguments because oftentimes there's no win there. There is no win. and you run your emotions ragged and your intellect ragged, and ultimately, as so often happens, we're left weary because they're going to be fine, because there's going to be every turn something to reinforce how they believe. So I think it's dangerous, but I know my good friend here, Nikole, has found herself in so many situations. How do you do it? No? You done with it?
I'm good now. I learned my lesson. What were they talking about, the killing in Charlotte? I mean, I'm just gonna have to agree with Trymaine at this point. You'll see, I'm on TV very, very sporadically because I don't need to go on there to debate nonsense. I'm not doing it. If I'm going on something to have a legitimate conversation and some real discourse, I'll do it. Otherwise, you're not using me for ratings because let me tell you. Joe Scarborough is not a stupid man. So if he's taking the viewpoint that somehow it is normal to send military into places that don't want it and pretend that that's just really in response to crime, and after all this time giving the President of the United States, a serial liar, the benefit of the doubt, stop going on the show. Because frankly, his intellect, Eddie Glaude's intellect, is far too superior to keep engaging in that nonsense. So I agree with you. I don't even debate on X social anymore.
That took a little while.
That's growth.
That's real growth.
But the truth was, it wasn't doing me any good. It wasn't doing my work any good. Just the people who were baiting you into nonsensical, bad faith conversations. Look, the times are too serious for nonsense, y'all. So no. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, that was good. Thank you. Thank you for that, man. Appreciate it. How do we get beyond just the stats and being reduced down to stat lines? I think what's gotten harder to do in this economic environment and the environment in our industry is to go to the people. My bread and butter was always to go to the people because then I can show you. I'm not proud to say that when I was a young reporter, I never liked going to city council meetings. I didn't know what was going on really. I didn't understand how government worked enough. So what I would do is I would just go to the neighborhood and the community and then get the story there and paint such a rich picture of what was happening that it was irrefutable. You can't argue with that. It was too good. And no one else could do that. And I think in an ideal world, we'd say, you know what? Instead of getting locked in these stats, let's talk about that mother who has to take 5 buses to get the kids to school and show that. And then you can back up and speak to the deficiencies in the educational system or the transportation. You could do all that. But it's like you have to go to the people, right? And then there's no lose because you have a great lead. You'll have all the richness and you'll have character. And then you can sprinkle it in and have a couple graphs that contextualize it properly and satisfy their needs for a trend. But my concern is the industry has shifted so much, and the appetite and the way we consume news and information. We're old enough. It's like whiplash. How can we concentrate enough on the story that matters when we're literally scrolling and the best stuff that they shove down our throats are 30 seconds? That's a whole different crisis. But I think still the fundamental of storytelling is finding ways to still get to the people, right? That go beyond stats. What's a stat line? And this is one thing that I'm glad bothers me. One death, one kid somewhere. That's how terrible that is. How bad that's earth shifting for people. So I hate the whole stat thing. I hate it with a passion. Thank you for that question, man. Thank y'all so much. This was my first one. I ain't cried. She tried to get me to cry, but I didn't do it. Thank y'all very much.
So I just want to say your passion for reporting, your passion for Black people, your passion for justice and making sure that we're seen in all of our humanity just shines through. It always has shown through in your decades of journalism. And again, so proud of you for this book, y'all. Please buy the book, read the book, share the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much.